There. Right now, we're going to welcome Lori Ann LaRocco, Senior Editor of Guests over at CNBC, for a roundtable that's not quite a roundtable as much as it is just a discussion between the two of us. But Lori Ann, thank you for joining us today. It's been a while since we've had you on, and so we're going to kind of get some really good insight about what's been going on with the situation at the ports lately. So thanks for joining us, and let's start off kind of talking about where the West Coast ports are sitting right now.
Wow. It's like a big matzo ball, isn't it? Well, I mean, there's a lot of congestion. In fact, I'm writing about it today. As you know, Freightways is a part of the CNBC supply chain heat map team. And this is where we actually give you a really live look, if you will, at the state of the ports. And the biggest problem right now facing the ports is the congestion at the rails. I spoke with both the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach last night, and over 60% of all of the containers that are currently waiting to leave that are 9 days and longer, they are all bound for the rail. And we're looking at tens of billions of dollars of trade that are landlocked. More importantly, we're all waiting to see if the Biden administration is going to enact this presidential board, if you will, to thwart the ability for the railways to strike. As you know, on Monday, that's the deadline where, with the mediation, with this agreement, so to speak, if the president does not step in, the railway unions will be able to strike if they do want to. And from what I've been told, Kaylee, if the rails do indeed strike, that would be far worse than a strike by the longshoremen.
So when we're talking about the possibility for, I would almost say maybe a double strike, is that something that could happen? Like, could we see the longshoremen go on strike as they're undergoing ILWU contract negotiations, which they've told us so far they're not planning on doing that, right? Because their main gripes are with wages and with automation. They're not planning on a work stoppage. But if that were to be worst case scenario with both the strike with the longshoremen and on the rails, what would kind of be the overarching effects? Just no goods movement whatsoever?
In theory, yes, along on the West Coast. I mean, because what's happening is I spoke with Gene Soroka last week. Gene told me that the Port of Los Angeles is currently at 90% land capacity. In order for a port to be truly efficient, you need that 70 to 75% capacity so trucks can move around. So if you're already at 90% capacity and it's only getting worse with each day because there's not enough rail chassis or equipment to move around, right? If heaven forbid the longshoremen wanted to stop working in service of the ports, it would just be the truckers moving whatever they could that's right there. But it would be an entire stoppage, if you will, from the West Coast. On the East Coast, a rail strike would impact the rail service going from the ports. And I reported last week, you now have more trade being diverted from the West Coast to the East Coast. And Hapag-Lloyd and Norfolk Southern have a very popular route right now where, get this, you're going to the port of Norfolk, you're putting your container on a rail to go to Chicago, to go back to the West Coast, and get this, it's faster. So it would riddle the West Coast, just, it would cripple it if, heaven forbid, you had that double strike. But it would also really clog up the East Coast ports if, God forbid, you had a rail strike.
And so when we're talking about those East Coast ports, times from ship to berth to getting containers unloaded are just astronomical right now. We reported earlier this week that you've got people in Savannah saying that they're on average waiting 9 to 12 days. People in ports of New York and New Jersey waiting sometimes 20 plus days to get their cargo just off of the ship in general. And then when we look at that and compare that with container dwell times, once they've been unloaded in the Port of Long Beach and LA, they're sitting on average now from 9 to 12 days as well. So it's kind of like, no matter where you're getting your freight, it's kind of like this game of hurry up and wait, right? Do you think that there is a better viable option right now, or is there kind of a workaround from waiting, or do shippers just need to be patient with what they're getting?
I think shippers have to be patient with what they're getting. I mean, logistics managers know that, based at one point, we were looking at 80 to 100 days, right, getting our product. And so that's why you started seeing the shift of trade moving from the West Coast to the East Coast. I recently sat down with the CEO of Tractor Supply at the National Retail Federation's logistics conference. And he told me they started moving their containers away from the West Coast back in October. So we need some common sense here. If you're going to be moving trade from one port to the other. And, according to the supply chain heat map, the East Coast ports are way more efficient than the West Coast ports by far. and they are able to move the product out of the port. It's where the weight is where it goes, right? It goes to the peel pile container, the pop-up container yards or the peel piles, wherever it may be. But that said, you got to pack your patients, and you have to realize that everybody is moving in the same direction. And if you want to air freight it in, there are challenges to that as well.
Right. There's not an easy kind of one size fits all solution or one applicable solution with it. And if you are finding a workaround, you're going to pay for that, because even though rates are starting to take a little bit of a dive, they're still remaining fairly elevated on the ocean and specifically on the air side as well. When we're talking about now shippers looking at what they're paying for freight to come in and then just wait, has there been any pushback on shippers saying, you know what, we're not going to pay for this if we're not going to get our things in a timely manner? Or are they just now having to pack the patients and the ability to pay, or the willingness to pay alongside that?
They're going to have to do what they've been doing for the last 2 years. I mean, if you want the product, and more importantly, we love that drayage and demurrage. If you want your box, you got to pay for it. And then, now at least with the Shipping Act, it has empowered them where if you want to go to the extra step, right, and go to the Federal Maritime Commission and contest the charges, now the onus is on the carrier. So hopefully then maybe you'll get your money back in a faster period of time if, depending on what happens there. But, this is the new normal. And, whereas the volumes are not as tremendous, if you will, compared to last year, they're still very, very high. In fact, the Port of Savannah, which you pointed out earlier, they told me, they're seeing dozens upon dozens of vessels that are ad hoc, unscheduled vessels coming in this month. And that's a result of the uncertainty that the logistics managers are facing on the West Coast.
I think when we talk about the West Coast from kind of a general public perception, a lot of people see that the numbers of ships awaiting berth in the San Pedro Bay have pulled back substantially from their high points last year. And people are like, yes, the problem is fixed. But that's not the case, right? Just because there's not 110, 115 ships waiting doesn't mean that freight is not still unable to be moved. And we know that we got a lot of government intervention and a lot of government eyes on it because that number of ships was so staggeringly high. Do you think that now that those ships are pulling back and some of them are being rerouted to the East Coast, that we'll see that same type of attention driven to the inland situation as well as that moved over to the East Coast?
We haven't seen it yet with the Biden administration. And to be quite honest, I'm really shocked. You're at the point of where you might have a strike, with the rails. There's a tremendous amount of pileup. The problem is you've got the slow steaming, which gives you this false positive, if you will, of less ships. It's not the fact. I recently, and I wish I would have sent this over, my apologies, there's a great data set from Project 44, which shows you the tremendous amount of rerouting of trade from the West Coast to the East Coast. All of those volumes are still coming. And even more importantly, they are still seeing a lot of containers, if you will, going to the West Coast. And in fact, Oakland is expecting even more containers, thankfully, coming because, as you know, they've been suffering, if you will, from the canceled sailings. When it comes to the inland ports, that's a problem with what Carl Bensel of the Federal Maritime Commission has been trying to tackle. The reason why there is such problems with the rail is because the ocean carriers dictate what rails they want their containers to go on. They don't want their containers just to go everywhere within the inland because they want to get back to China. And so what, Carl Bensel wants, the commissioner of the one of the commissioners of the FMC, he wants the FMC to have more oversight in the rails so the ocean carriers do not dictate. I spoke with the Port of Utah, which is an inland port, and he said they would love to get more containers, but they're not going to because the ocean carriers don't want to spread the wealth, if you will. They're not diffusing the flow of trade within these pipes. You have a tremendous amount of congestion going on a very limited amount of pipes, whereas if you diversified it to the other inland ports, it would free up the system and it would make it go faster. But that is up to the decision of the ocean carriers.
So while we're mentioning the regulatory space, I want to take a little bit of a pivot to kind of talk about the topic that's been top of mind for everybody on the West Coast, the decision to not hear the AB5 case, which then immediately went into effect, of course. And when we're talking about AB5 and the impact on these truckers in California, we're not talking directly about criminal penalties of companies saying, you know what, we're rounding up our independent owner operators, we're throwing them in jail, they're not operating. We're talking more about kind of if things were to progress, they're going to have to change their business practices, and it goes as it goes. Are we seeing immediate impacts from the AB5 ruling from the actual company side and the law following side, or are we seeing more impacts by people kind of overreacting, starting to protest, and almost taking themselves out of the ability to run right now?
I think it's the latter. I mean, gosh, when I read, the strike, it's like, geez, really? A day of stoppage? I mean, trade needs to move in order for, and that's what I don't understand about any of this between the strife that we have around the world with the various ports, like what we have with Germany right now. If you want to make money, if every facet in the world of trade wants to make money, trade has to move. A container at rest is not making money. A chassis at rest is not making money. A vessel at rest is not making money. So people need to come to the table and realize, okay, what do I need to do? What kind of compromises do I have to do in order to make money? And also, when it comes to the independent contractors, I mean, that's something that, of course, lawmakers decided on. Why, heaven only knows. But, when it comes to all of this, the world of trade does not need a work stoppage either for one day or for one shift, because the ability to pick up and go where you are, to catch back up, there is no ability to catch up.
And then staying on that thread, with the potential of federal intervention, could there be federal intervention stepping over the AB5 ruling in California if the situation gets dire enough? Or do you think that the federal government would say, we're kind of remaining hands off on this because it is almost like the workers and the drivers themselves that are putting them in the position of the work stoppage? The law itself isn't necessarily preventing them from running.
Well, exactly. I mean, the law, they're a victim of their own actions as of right now. I mean, when you look at the current state of labor affairs, right, be it the longshoremen, be it with the railroads, the Biden administration has been very upfront saying they're taking this hands-off approach of, quote, being the honest broker. So I would assume, based on what we're seeing, right, with the current labor statuses of the various things, they're going to continue to do just that. Although I did speak with the White House earlier, and they are taking the procedural purposes, if you will, in looking at this presidential board, right, to possibly intervene with the railroads. It's not a definite that they will. So I think it's just everyone has to wait and see.
All right, Lorianne. Well, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you on as always. What are you currently working on? You mentioned as part of that supply chain visibility, the heat map that you're working on. What else are you working on for CNBC right now?
I'm predominantly working on that right now, as well as looking at more about like the technology of how to seize on the spot rates, and I'm also going to be focusing on that as well for my American Shipper column as well, the actionability, right, of how to seize opportunity during these times of uncertainty.
All right, well, we'll be keeping an eye out for that. Thank you so much again for joining us. We will talk to you again soon. Thank you guys all for joining us today for Freight Waves Now, because that does it for us here on this Friday morning. But as we mentioned earlier, we've got a ton of stuff coming up here for the rest of us, the rest of the month, the rest of the week here on Freight Waves as well. Let's talk a little bit more about those upcoming events. Coming up August 17th, we've got our next virtual event, Supply Chain Meets FinTech. That's going to be online, and that one is free to register for. You can head to live.freightwaves.com to get that one in. And while you're there, go ahead and register for the Autonomous and Electrical Vehicle Summit as well. That one's going to be September 7th. Also free registration for that. Today, July 15th, is the last day to save some money on those F3, the Future of Freight Festival tickets. Also find those at live.freightwaves.com. If you get them in by this evening, you will save $700 on those tickets. And then while you're there, go ahead and get your nominations in for our Freight Tech 100. Those nominations opened last week. They will be running through August 26th. You got the chance to nominate your favorite freight tech companies, and we will announce those winners at F3. Coming up for the rest of the day, we've got What the Truck Would Do and the Dude live at noon, and then Running on Ice is this afternoon. We'll see you guys tomorrow or Monday morning. Have a great weekend.